Park Jean-seo built his legend on iron-fisted control, blood-soaked streets, and alliances forged in the darkest corners of Busousan. He was a man who never let emotion cloud his judgment, until the night his new bride flinched beneath his tattooed hand. The marriage was supposed to be a clinical transaction. Sign the parchment, secure the territory, and claim the woman who came with the deal. But Min Ha-rin wasn't the hardened Mafia princess he expected. She was a silent plea, an innocent soul sacrificed like a lamb to a wolf by her own father's greed. When Jean-seo realized the truth of her purity, he was driven to a state of obsessive frenzy he couldn't name. He faced a choice that would redefine his empire: treat her as the property he bought, or become the absolute, terrifying protector of the only pure thing he had ever touched. That single night would drive him crazy and unravel them both. If you want to see how this obsessive love story ends, stay with me until the very last word. And before we start, drop a comment with your city. I love seeing how far these stories of power and passion reach. Now, let's begin. The dragon's penthouse sat atop the highest spire in Busousan like a crown of cold glass and steel. It was a place of silent opulence, where the city's lights looked like distant, unreachable stars. Park Jean-seo stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, a glass of untouched premium soju in his hand, his shirtless back displaying the intricate dragons and tigers of his rank. He had ruled these streets for 15 years, and he had never once been surprised. "You look like a man waiting for a war, not a wedding night," Secretary Jung said, appearing quietly at his side. He was Jean-seo's longest ally, the only person who dared to speak the truth to the boss. "It's just a signature on a blood contract." Jean-seo's voice was as cold and flat as the glass before him. "The deal is done. The territories are mine. The wife is just the final line of the agreement." The heavy scent of aged ink and cold metal filled the private office of the dragon's penthouse, a space where silence was usually absolute. On the antique desk, a single sheet of heavy parchment lay between two men who had spent the last decade trying to destroy one another. Chairman Kang sat across from Jean-seo, his hands clasped tightly to hide the slight tremor in his fingers. He was a man whose glory had faded into a desperate, hollow shell, and tonight, he was here to pay a price he couldn't afford with currency. Jean-seo leaned forward into the light of the desk lamp, the shadows carving deep, sharp lines into his face. He didn't look like a groom. He looked like a debt collector. "The territories in the north and the shipping lanes in Busousan," Jean-seo said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "Those were the terms for your life, Kang. But your life isn't worth the paper this is written on anymore." Chairman Kang swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the black ink at the bottom of the page. "The alliance is more than just land, Park. You know the council won't accept a takeover without a blood tie. You need a wife to solidify the claim. You need the Kang name to stop the other syndicates from revolting." "I don't need a name," Jean-seo countered, his eyes flashing with a cold, predatory light. "I need a guarantee that you won't slip a blade between my ribs the moment I turn my back. A blood tie ensures your loyalty, or at least your silence." With a slow, deliberate motion, Jean-seo unsheathed a small, ceremonial knife from the desk. He didn't flinch as he drew the blade across the palm of his hand, letting a few drops of dark blood fall onto the wax seal of the contract. He pushed the knife across the desk toward Kang. "Sign it," Jean-seo commanded. "An alliance for a daughter. Min Ha-rin becomes mine tonight. Her life, her loyalty, and her future are the collateral for your survival. If you break this pact, I won't come for your business. I'll come for what's left of your bloodline." Chairman Kang's hand shook as he took the knife. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was trading the one pure thing he had left, the daughter he had kept hidden from the filth of his world, to the very man who had dismantled his empire. It was a coward's trade, a sacrifice made in the shadows to keep the sun from setting on his own life. As the chairman pressed his own blood into the seal, the deal was finalized. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier, as if the walls themselves were witness to the injustice. "She's innocent, Jean-seo," Kang whispered, his voice cracking for the first time. "She doesn't know about the streets. She doesn't know about the blood. She thinks this is a marriage of honor. Min Ha-rin stood up, the light catching the dark ink of the dragon spiraling up his neck. He looked at the chairman with a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. There is no honor in this room, Chairman. Only debt, Min Ha-rin said, picking up the contract. I don't care what she knows or what she thinks. She is a line in a contract, a piece of territory I have just acquired. I will treat her exactly as the payment she is. He turned his back on the broken man, signaling the end of the meeting. He had won. He had secured the alliance, and he had claimed the woman. In his mind, it was just another signature, another acquisition to be managed with the same cold restraint he applied to everything else. He had no idea that the payment, waiting for him, was about to shatter the very foundation of his world. He thought he was bringing a pawn into his palace. He didn't realize he had just invited a miracle into his darkness, and that the first night would drive him to a madness he would never want to escape. The air in the bridal suite was thick with a suffocating scent of lilies and expensive hairspray, but to Min Ha-rin, it felt like the sterile chill of a funeral parlor. She sat motionless before the vanity, her reflection a ghost of the woman she had been only weeks ago. The heavy, traditional lace of her wedding veil cascaded over her shoulders, a delicate cage that felt as weighted as a suit of armor. Every time the stylists adjusted a pin or smoothed a fold of her silk robe, Ha-rin flinched, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs that no amount of deep breathing could silence. Behind her, the reflection of Chairman Kang appeared in the mirror. He stood like a monument to cold ambition, his eyes devoid of the fatherly warmth she had spent her life praying for. He placed a hand on her shoulder, and Ha-rin had to bite her lip to keep from crying out. His touch was not a comfort. It was the heavy hand of a merchant checking his prize before delivery. You look exactly as a bride of the Kang lineage should, Ha-rin, he said, his voice smooth and devoid of remorse. Elegant. Compliant. Perfect. Is this really the only way, father? Ha-rin's voice was a fragile whisper, barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning. To be traded like a piece of property to a man the whole city fears? They call him a monster. They say he has no heart. Chairman Kang's grip tightened just enough to signal his displeasure. They say many things about Park Jean-seo. What matters is that he is the only man powerful enough to keep our family name from being erased. You aren't just a daughter today, Ha-rin. You are a bridge. You are the collateral that ensures I can keep breathing. He leaned down, his lips close to the lace of her veil. Do not embarrass me. Do not show him this weakness. Men like Min Ha-rin are like wolves. They can smell fear, and they despise it. You will walk down that aisle. You will say your vows, and you will fulfill your duty. Do you understand? Ha-rin nodded slowly, the movement making the diamonds in her hair catch the light with a mocking sparkle. She understood perfectly. She was the innocent sacrifice being offered to appease a dragon. She had been kept in the shadows of her father's estate her entire life, protected from the blood and the filth of the streets, only to be thrown directly into the center of the fire when it suited his needs. The stylists returned to finish the final touches, painting her lips a soft, muted red and dusting her skin with powder to hide the paleness of her terror. As they draped the heavy bridal train behind her, Ha-rin felt the finality of it settling over her soul. This wasn't a beginning. It was an ending. She was being prepared for a night she had been told was a rite of passage, but in the dark world of the Mafia, she knew it was a surrender. She looked at her hands, clasped tightly in her lap. They were small and untainted, never having known the weight of a weapon or the touch of a man. She thought of Park Jean-seo, the man whose neck bore the mark of a dragon, whose reputation was built on a foundation of silence and shadow. To the world, he was a king to be feared. To her, he was the storm that was about to swallow her whole. It's time, her father announced, checking his gold watch. Ha-rin rose, the silk of her gown hissing against the floor. She felt like a sleepwalker moving toward a precipice. As she walked toward the door, she caught one last glimpse of herself in the full-length mirror. Beneath the layers of lace and the shimmering jewels, her eyes were wide and dark with a visceral vulnerability. She was a lamb being led to the wolf's den, her innocence the only thing she had left to lose. She didn't know that the man waiting for her at the end of the aisle believed he was receiving a calculated partner. She didn't know that her terror would be the very thing to shatter his cold restraint. All she knew was that the doors were opening, the music was starting, and the first night of her new life was waiting to drive the monster she married into a madness he would never want to leave. The Cathedral of St. Jude in the heart of the city had been cleared of its worshippers, replaced by men whose sins were whispered in the back alleys of Busousan and Seoul. The air inside the cavernous space was chilled, not by the stone walls, but by the collective presence of 1,000 secrets. Park Jean-seo stood at the altar, a figure of absolute, unyielding stillness. His black tuxedo was tailored with a precision that bordered on lethal, the high collar hiding the ink of the dragon that marked his skin, but unable to mask the predatory energy that radiated from him. He didn't look like a man waiting to be united with his soulmate. He looked like a general overseeing a surrender. As the heavy oak doors at the back of the cathedral groaned open, the small, elite crowd of criminals and power brokers went silent. Jean-seo watched as the silhouette of Min Ha-rin appeared, framed by the blinding daylight of the world outside before the doors shut her into his darkness. She moved down the aisle with a slow, mechanical gait, her father's hand heavy on her arm. Beneath the weight of the traditional lace veil, she was a blur of white silk and shimmering diamonds. Jean-seo watched her approach with a clinical detachment that had served him well in every business deal he'd ever closed. To him, this wasn't a marriage. It was a merger. He analyzed the way her shoulders trembled slightly, attributing it to the cold or perhaps the gravity of joining the Park syndicate. He noted the way she kept her head bowed, assuming it was the practiced modesty of a high-society daughter who knew her place. He saw the property he had purchased, and he was satisfied with the quality of the asset. He remained unaware that beneath that heavy lace, Ha-rin was fighting for every breath, her lungs feeling as though they were being squeezed by the very diamonds in her hair. He didn't see the way her eyes darted toward the exit in a frantic, silent prayer for an escape that would never come. When they finally reached the altar, Chairman Kang stepped forward, his eyes meeting Jean-seo's for a fleeting second. It was a look of mutual understanding, the merchant handing over the goods. As Kang placed Ha-rin's small, gloved hand into Jean-seo's, the contrast was jarring. His hand was large, warm, and calloused by a life of violence. Hers was ice-cold and felt as fragile as a bird's wing. The priest's voice began to drone, the sacred words of the ceremony falling flat against the rows of men with guns hidden beneath their silk jackets. Jean-seo didn't listen to the vows. He was already thinking about the shipping lanes, the North Side territories, and the message this alliance would send to his rivals. He was a man of iron and logic, and in his mind, Ha-rin was just a beautiful, silent placeholder in the grand architecture of his power. "I do," Jean-seo said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that carried to the very back of the cathedral. It was a statement of fact, a verbal signature on a blood-signed contract. When it was Ha-rin's turn, her voice was so thin it was almost swallowed by the vastness of the vaulted ceiling. I do." It sounded like a final breath. The ceremony concluded with a kiss that was as cold as the contract itself, a mere formality for the cameras and the witnesses. As they turned to face the room of criminals, the applause was measured and polite, the sound of men acknowledging a successful transaction. Jean-seo led his bride out of the cathedral, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back. He felt the tension in her frame, the way she seemed to shrink away from the crowd, and he felt a surge of arrogant satisfaction. He believed he had bought a queen to sit beside him, a woman who understood the game. He had no idea that the calculated partner he thought he had acquired was currently drowning in terror. He didn't know that the first night, in the privacy of his glass and steel fortress, her innocence would dismantle every defense he had spent 15 years building. He thought he was walking toward his greatest victory, but as the limousine door closed them into a silent, suffocating intimacy, he was actually walking toward a madness that would change the very definition of his empire. The ride from the cathedral to the dragon's penthouse was a journey of suffocating silence. The city lights of Busousan blurred into long, distorted streaks of neon against the tinted glass of the limousine, but inside the car, the air was static and thin. Min Ha-rin sat perfectly upright, his silhouette a sharp, dark edge against the luxury leather. He didn't speak, and he didn't reach for Ha-rin's hand. To him, the deal was done. The prize was in the car. There was no need for further theater. Beside him, Ha-rin felt as though the very lace of her veil was beginning to choke her. Every time the car hit a small bump in the road, she flinched, her fingers digging into the silk of her gown until her nails left crescent moon marks in the fabric. She looked out at the passing buildings, realizing with a sick lurch in her stomach that she was being driven away from the only life she had ever known, however cold it had been, and into the fortress of a man whose name was synonymous with shadow. The limousine pulled into a private, underground elevator bay. The doors opened with a soft, mechanical hiss, and Min Ha-rin finally turned to her. His hazel eyes were unreadable, like the surface of deep water at night. "We're here," he said. It wasn't an invitation, it was a notification. He stepped out and waited, his presence looming over the small space. Ha-rin gathered her heavy skirts, her movements clumsy and frantic. As she stepped out onto the polished concrete, the sheer height of the spire above them seemed to press down on her. Min Ha-rin led her toward the private elevator, his hand settling firmly on the small of her back. The touch was possessive and heavy, a constant reminder that the contract was now in effect. The elevator climbed in a blur of silent speed, the floor numbers flickering like a countdown. When the door slid open, they stepped directly into the penthouse. It was a space of brutal, masculine elegance, all black marble, dark wood, and floor-to-ceiling glass that made the city below look like a carpet of fire. It was a place designed for a man who needed to see everything and be seen by no one. Min Ha-rin walked into the center of the living area and shed his tuxedo jacket, tossing it onto a leather chair with a casualness that made Ha-rin's pulse skyrocket. He began to unbutton his cuffs, his movements slow and methodical. "Secretary Young has already had your belongings moved to the secondary suite," Min Ha-rin said, his back to her. "But for tonight, you stay with me. Those were the terms your father agreed to." Ha-rin stood by the entrance, her white gown a stark, tragic contrast to the dark marble. She felt like a trespasser in a temple of power. I understand, my lord." Min Ha-rin paused, his hands going still at his wrists. He turned slowly, a ghost of a smile playing at the corner of his mouth, a smile that held no warmth. "My lord, your father didn't tell you? In this house, I am not a lord. I am the man who paid for your life. You can drop the high society manners, Ha-rin. They have no value here." He walked toward her, the distance between them shrinking until she could smell the faint, expensive scent of his cologne mixed with the metallic tang of the city air. He reached out, his fingers catching the edge of her veil. Ha-rin closed her eyes, her breath hitching in a sob she managed to swallow. "The ceremony was for the council," Min Ha-rin whispered, his voice a dark rasp that vibrated in the quiet room. "The party was for the streets. But this..." He stepped closer, his shadow swallowing her completely. "This is the transaction." With a sudden, decisive motion, he pulled the heavy lace veil from her head. It fell to the floor in a heap of discarded innocence, leaving Ha-rin's face exposed and trembling in the harsh light of the penthouse. Min Ha-rin looked down at her, his clinical detachment finally starting to fray at the edges. He saw the way her throat moved as she swallowed, the way her eyes were wide and dark with a visceral, animal terror. He had expected a woman who would bargain, a woman who would use her beauty as a weapon to secure her position in his bed. He had expected the daughter of Chairman Kang to be a shark in silk. But as he looked into her eyes, he saw only the lamb. "Go to the bedroom," he commanded, his voice hardening to hide the sudden, strange thrum of his own heart. "Clean yourself of that paint and those jewels. I will be there shortly to claim what I have bought." Ha-rin didn't argue. She couldn't. She turned and walked toward the master suite, her train hissing against the marble like a warning. Behind her, Min Ha-rin stood in the center of his glass kingdom, his hands clenched at his sides. He thought he was ready to close the final line of the deal. He had no idea that behind those bedroom doors, the transaction was about to become a discovery that would drive him to a madness he would never want to leave. The dragon had brought the sacrifice home, but it was the dragon who was about to be burned. The master suite was a cavern of obsidian and shadow, illuminated only by the cold, silver glow of the moon reflecting off the Han River far below. Ha-rin stood at the edge of the sprawling bed, her fingers fumbling with the intricate silk ties of her robe. She had removed the heavy bridal gown, but she still felt the phantom weight of it, a ghost of the contract that now bound her soul. When the door clicked shut behind her, she didn't need to turn around to know Min Ha-rin had entered. The very air in the room seemed to displace, heavy and charged with a scent of rain and expensive tobacco. Min Ha-rin didn't speak. He moved with the predatory silence of a man who owned the night, shedding his shirt as he crossed the room. In the dim light, the dragons and tigers inked across his skin seemed to writhe, their dark coils marking him as a man of 1,000 violences. He stopped just inches behind her, his heat radiating through the thin silk of her robe. "Turn around," he commanded, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that vibrated against her spine. Ha-rin obeyed, her movements jerky and stiff. As she turned, her eyes remained fixed on the floor, her long lashes casting trembling shadows against her pale cheeks. Min Ha-rin reached out, his large, calloused hand cupping her chin to force her gaze upward. "Look at me, Ha-rin," he whispered. "I want to see the eyes of the woman who cost me 3 territories." When she finally met his gaze, the impact was physical. Min Ha-rin's breath hitched, his thumb freezing against the soft line of her jaw. He had expected the hardened, weary eyes of a woman who had seen the underbelly of Chairman Kang's empire. He had expected a gaze that knew how to lie, how to manipulate, and how to survive. Instead, he found a mirror of absolute, untainted purity. Ha-rin's eyes were wide and swimming with a visceral, heartbreaking shock. They weren't the eyes of a Mafia princess. They were the eyes of a girl who had been kept in a glass cage, sheltered from the very existence of men like him. As he looked closer, tracing the fine lines of her face, he realized there was no paint left to hide behind. Her skin was like porcelain, untouched and glowing with a terrifying innocence. "You've never been to the clubs," Min Ha-rin noted, his voice losing its clinical edge and sharpening into something more dangerous, something closer to wonder. "You've never sat at the tables while the deals were made. Your father, he didn't just hide you. He preserved you." Ha-rin's lower lip trembled, a single tear escaping to track a path down her cheek. "I was only ever allowed the garden and the library," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread. I thought the world was beautiful. Until today." Min Ha-rin felt a sudden, violent jolt in his chest, a sensation more jarring than any bullet he had ever taken. He realized in that moment that he hadn't just bought a wife. He had been handed a miracle he was entirely unprepared to handle. Every woman he had ever known was a player in the game, someone with a price or a hidden blade. But the girl standing before him didn't even know how to hide her terror. He let his hand drift from her chin to the base of her throat, feeling the frantic, fluttering pulse of her jugular. She flinched, a small, choked sound escaping her lips, and the sensation of her soft skin against his rough palms sent a shockwave of overjoyed possessiveness through his veins. He realized with a clarity that bordered on madness that she had never been touched, not by a man, and certainly not by the world he inhabited. "He lied to me," Min Ha-rin murmured, his eyes darkening until they were almost black. "Chairman Kang told me you were ready. He told me you were a woman who understood the price of power." He leaned in, his forehead nearly touching hers, his breath ghosting over her lips. The discovery was driving him to the brink of a loss of control he had never experienced. He felt a crazy surge of triumph, a primitive joy that he was the one who would finally shatter that glass cage. "You are not a partner, Ha-rin," he whispered, his grip tightening just enough to make her gasp. "You are a treasure. And I think I'm going to enjoy teaching you exactly what kind of monster you've been given to." He didn't know then that his joy was a prelude to an obsession that would consume his empire. He only knew that the transaction was dead, and in its place was a hunger that no contract could ever satisfy. The unveiling was complete, and as he looked at her wide-eyed shock, Min Ha-rin realized the first night was no longer about a deal. It was about a king claiming the only thing in his kingdom that was truly priceless. The air in the bedroom, once stagnant with Ha-rin's dread, suddenly ignited with a frantic, electric tension. Min Ha-rin's hand, still resting against the fragile line of her throat, began to tremble, not with hesitation, but with a surge of adrenaline so potent it felt like a physical blow. He stared down at her, his eyes darting across her features as if seeing her for the very first time. The clinical, detached boss who had signed the blood contract an hour ago was dead. In his place was a man possessed by a discovery so rare it was driving him to the brink of sanity. "You really are a ghost, aren't you?" he whispered, his voice cracking into a jagged, manic rasp. "A ghost kept in a garden of glass." He laughed, a short, sharp sound that held no humor, only a dark, explosive triumph. The realization that she was untainted, that she had never been looked at, let alone touched, by the vultures he called his rivals, sent a wave of overjoyed madness through his veins. It was the thrill of the ultimate acquisition, a prize so pure that it made his entire empire look like a heap of ash. His heart hammered against his ribs, a violent, syncopated rhythm that matched the frantic pulse beneath his thumb. "My lord, you're hurting me," Ha-rin whimpered, her voice breaking as she tried to pull back. But Min Ha-rin didn't let go. If anything, his grip tightened, his fingers threading into the dark silk of her hair to tilt her face further back. His hazel eyes were no longer unreadable. They were burning with a fierce, terrifying fire. The calculated mask he had worn for 15 years hadn't just cracked. It had shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. "Don't call me that," he growled, his face inches from hers, his breath hot against her trembling lips. "I am not your lord. I am the man who owns every breath you take from this moment on. Do you understand? Every single one." He felt a crazy urge to shield her and crush her all at once. The discovery of her purity had triggered a possessive frenzy that bypassed his logic and went straight to his blood. He looked at the white silk of her robe, then at the dark, intricate ink of the dragons on his own arms, and the contrast made him growl low in his throat. He was the filth of the world, and she was the miracle he had accidentally bought. He began to pace around her, his shirtless body moving with a restless, jagged energy. He looked like a predator circling a sacred altar. He couldn't stop looking at her, at the way the moonlight caught the tears on her cheeks, at the way she looked so utterly, beautifully out of place in his obsidian fortress. "Chairman Kang, that coward," Min Ha-rin muttered, his hands clenching into white-knuckled fists. He didn't know what he was giving away. He thought he was paying a debt. He didn't realize he was handing me the only thing that could ever make me feel like I have a soul. He stopped in front of her again, his presence so overwhelming that Ha-rin felt as though the walls were closing in. He reached out, his touch no longer clinical but feverish, his palm sliding down her arm to her wrist, anchoring her to him. The intensity in his gaze was so heavy it felt like a physical weight. He was over the edge now, driven into a state where the alliance, the shipping lanes, and the territories meant nothing. Only the girl mattered. Only her purity remained the center of his universe. "I'm going to keep you," he whispered, his voice thick with a possessive hunger that made Ha-rin's knees buckle. "I'm going to build walls, so high the world will forget you ever existed. You will be the secret that drives me mad, Ha-rin. And I will burn anyone who even thinks about looking at what belongs to me." He pulled her toward him, the collision of her soft silk and his hard, tattooed skin sending a fresh jolt of overjoyed shock through his system. The transaction was over. The obsession had begun. As he looked into her wide, terrified eyes, Min Ha-rin knew he wasn't just a boss anymore. He was a man who had found his religion in the ruin of a contract, and the first night was only just beginning to drive him to the madness he had searched for his entire life. The proximity in the room was no longer just a physical measurement. It had become a visceral weight, pressing the oxygen from Ha-rin's lungs. Min Ha-rin stood before her, his chest heaving with the jagged, uneven rhythm of a man who had forgotten how to breathe. The moonlight through the floor-to-ceiling glass carved the shadows of his tattoos into his skin, making the dragons on his ribs look as though they were ready to strike. He reached out, his hand moving with a slow, agonizing deliberation toward her face, and that was when it happened. As his fingers brushed the soft silk at her shoulder, Ha-rin's instinct overrode her terror. Her small, pale hand flew up, pressing firmly against the center of his chest to stop his advance. The collision was instantaneous and absolute. Her palm landed directly over his heart, her soft, unblemished skin meeting the dark, intricate ink of a snarling tiger. The heat of him scorched her, a furnace of raw, masculine energy that made her entire arm tremble. Beneath her fingertips, she could feel the violent, thundering gallop of his heart, a rhythmic drumming that told her he was just as affected by this moment as she was. Jin-seo froze. He looked down at her hand, his eyes wide and fixed on the sight of her slender fingers splayed against his ink-darkened skin. The contrast was devastating. Her hand was a symbol of everything he had never been allowed to touch: purity, light, and an innocence that hadn't been bought or sold. His chest was a map of his sins, a history of every war he had fought and every life he had taken. In the space where her palm met his tattoos, two worlds that were never meant to coexist crashed together in a silent explosion. "Don't," Ha-rin whispered, her voice a broken shard of sound. "Please, you're too much. You're too dangerous." She didn't pull her hand away. She couldn't. It was as if the connection had fused them together. She felt the vibration of his low, guttural growl deep in his chest, a sound that was half warning and half surrender. Jin-seo leaned into her hand, not to push past it, but to feel the pressure of her touch, his eyes closing for a fleeting second as if he were trying to memorize the sensation of something untainted. "I am the danger, Ha-rin," he rasped, his voice dropping to a register that made her skin prickle. "I am the storm your father sold you to. But your hand, it's like ice on a fever." He looked back up, and the intensity in his hazel eyes had shifted from a crazy frenzy to a focused, lethal obsession. He didn't see a maid or a pawn anymore. He saw a sanctuary. The flinch, the desperate press of her hand to keep him at bay, had done the opposite of what she intended. It hadn't pushed him away. It had anchored him to her soul. He covered her hand with his own, his large, scarred fingers curling around hers to trap her palm against his heart. He wanted her to feel the way she made his blood roar. He wanted her to know that the innocent sacrifice had just brought the most feared man in Busousan to his knees without firing a single shot. "You think you're stopping me," he whispered, stepping even closer until the heat between them was a physical wall. "But you're only making it worse. I've spent my life in the dark, and you just turned on the sun. How am I supposed to let you go now?" Ha-rin looked up at him, her lips parted in a silent gasp. The collision was complete. The transaction was buried under the weight of a connection that neither of them understood. In the heart of his obsidian fortress, the Mafia boss and the virgin bride stood locked in a stalemate of power and purity, the first night driving them both into a territory where the only map was the frantic beating of two hearts against a single palm. The static electricity in the room shifted from a feverish intimacy to a cold, predatory focus as the weight of the truth finally settled in Jin-seo's mind. He stood in the center of the obsidian master suite, his hand still trapping Ha-rin's trembling palm against his heart, but his gaze had drifted past her, fixing on the dark silhouette of the city outside. The overjoyed frenzy that had gripped him upon discovering her purity was now being sharpened by a lethal, calculating rage. The realization hit him with the force of a landslide. Chairman Kang hadn't just provided a wife. He had knowingly discarded his only daughter into the hands of a man he called a monster, hoping her innocence would act as a buffer for his own sins. He hadn't groomed a partner for Jin-seo. He had gift-wrapped a victim to ensure his own survival. He knew, Jin-seo whispered, the words sounding like the first crack of thunder before a storm. "That coward. He knew exactly what you were, and he threw you to me to buy himself another year of breathing." He let go of Ha-rin's hand, the sudden loss of contact making her stagger back toward the edge of the bed. Min Ha-rin turned away, his muscles coiling with a restless, violent energy. He began to pace the length of the room, his shirtless back a map of moving ink as the tigers and dragons seemed to growl in the dim light. Every detail of the contract negotiation now replayed in his head with a sickening clarity. The way Kang's eyes had avoided his, the slight tremor in the old man's signature, the way he had insisted on a quiet wedding with no outside witnesses. It wasn't a merger. It was a disposal. My father. He said it was for the family, Ha-rin said, her voice small and brittle, like dry leaves underfoot. She pulled the silk of her robe tighter around her, as if she could hide from the realization that her life had been a currency her father spent without a second thought. He said you were the only one who could protect us. Min Ha-rin stopped his pacing and turned back to her, his hazel eyes flashing with a light that was no longer crazy with joy, but blackened with intent. He didn't want me to protect the family, Ha-rin. He wanted me to be distracted by you. He thought I would be so consumed by breaking you that I wouldn't notice him quietly rebuilding his shattered assets in the north. The betrayal tasted like copper in his mouth. In the underworld of Busousan, there were rules to the game, even for monsters. Selling one's own flesh and blood into a life of shadow without a word of warning was a transgression that demanded more than just a financial penalty. It demanded an ending. Min Ha-rin walked over to the nightstand and picked up his encrypted phone. He didn't look at the time. In his world, time was irrelevant when a debt was being called in. He dialed a single number. Secretary Young. Min Ha-rin said when the line connected, his voice a flat, terrifying monotone. Cancel the morning briefing. Mobilize the secondary strike teams. I want every asset Chairman Kang still holds, every warehouse, every shell company, every offshore account, frozen by sunrise. And find out where he's hiding. He isn't a partner anymore, he's a target. He ended the call and tossed the phone onto the bed. The transaction that had brought Ha-rin to this room was officially dead, replaced by a declaration of war that would set the city's skyline on fire. He moved back to Ha-rin, who was watching him with wide, terrified eyes, paralyzed by the sudden shift in the man who now owned her. He reached out, his touch surprisingly gentle as he brushed a stray lock of hair behind her ear, though the intensity in his gaze remained lethal. Your father thought he was giving me a pawn to play with, Min Ha-rin told her, his voice dropping to a register that was almost a caress. But he made a mistake. He gave me a reason to burn his world down. He thinks he saved his skin, but he just signed his own death warrant. He leaned in close, his shadow once again swallowing her. The alliance is over, Ha-rin. But you stay here. You are the only thing he had left that was worth anything, and now you belong to the man he tried to trick. He's going to watch from the gutters as I turn his sacrifice into my queen. The first night had begun with a contract and a discovery, but it was ending with the opening notes of a massacre. As Min Ha-rin looked at the innocent girl caught in the center of a storm, he felt a dark, possessive triumph. Chairman Kang had tried to save himself, but in doing so, he had given the dragon of Busousan the only thing that could make him truly unstoppable. The war had begun, and Min Ha-rin was ready to drive the whole world crazy to keep what was now his. The silence that followed Min Ha-rin's declaration of war was heavier than any sound that had preceded it. He stood before the floor-to-ceiling glass, the city of Busousan sprawling beneath him like a kingdom of flickering embers. In his hand, he held the blood-signed contract, the document that had defined Ha-rin as a transaction, a piece of territory, and a line of debt. Without taking his eyes off the horizon, Min Ha-rin gripped the heavy parchment and tore it down the center. He didn't stop until the fragments fell to the obsidian floor like dead leaves. The contract is dead, he said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of the penthouse. Ha-rin looked down at the shredded paper, her breath hitching in a confused, hopeful gasp. Am I free? Are you letting me go? Min Ha-rin turned slowly, and the look in his eyes made her hope wither instantly. The crazy intensity that had been sparked by the discovery of her purity had morphed into something deeper, darker, and infinitely more permanent. He walked toward her, each step measured and heavy, until he was close enough for her to feel the heat radiating from his tattooed skin. "Free," he whispered, a dark, jagged smile pulling at his mouth.
"No, Ha-rin."
"To free you would be to leave you to the vultures. To let you go would be to allow the filth of this world to touch what I have just discovered to be sacred." He reached out, his large hands framing her face with a gentleness that was more terrifying than his rage. His thumbs traced the line of her jaw, his touch possessive and feverish. "I am voiding the contract because I will not have our lives dictated by a coward's signature," he told her, his hazel eyes locking onto hers with a fierce, unyielding light. "From this moment on, you are not a bride of convenience or a pawn of the Kang lineage. You are mine, not by law, not by debt, but by my own will." Ha-rin trembled beneath his gaze, the collision of her innocence and his danger reaching its final, absolute stage. "What does that mean for me?" "It means that I am now the only wall between you and the world," Min Ha-rin vowed, his voice dropping to a register of pure, obsessive protection. "It means that every man who ever looked at you as a prize will answer to me. It means that your father's betrayal has bought you a protector who will burn the city to the ground before he lets a single shadow fall across your path." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, his breath ghosting over her lips. The overjoyed frenzy had settled into a cold, hard promise, a new vow that eclipsed anything said in the cathedral. "I am not your husband by a signed paper, Ha-rin. I am your absolute guardian. Your prison, your shield, and your king," he whispered. "You are the only pure thing in this blood-soaked city, and I am going to keep you exactly as you are. I will drive myself to madness, ensuring that you never have to see the darkness I live in." He pulled her into his arms, his tattooed chest a hard, warm wall against her silk-clad frame. As the sun began to bleed over the Busousan skyline, marking the end of their first night, Ha-rin realized that the transaction had truly ended. She hadn't been freed. She had been claimed by a man whose obsession would become her new world. Park Jean-seo had found his miracle, and as he held her in the cooling twilight, he knew that the war he had started was a small price to pay for the treasure he would now protect until the world itself stopped turning. The core conflict highlights that true worth cannot be quantified by a contract. Jean-seo begins the story viewing Ha-rin as a transaction, a line on a ledger used to acquire territory. However, his crazy joy and eventual obsession stem from discovering a level of purity and innocence that his billions could never buy. The story teaches that the most precious things in life are those that are untainted by greed and power. Ha-rin's innocence acts as a mirror that exposes the rot in those around her. Her father, Chairman Kang, possesses social status but lacks integrity, leading him to commit the ultimate betrayal of selling his child. In contrast, Jean-seo, despite being a criminal, is moved to a state of moral realization by Ha-rin's purity. It suggests that genuine goodness has the power to dismantle even the most hardened, cynical hearts. A major moral pivot occurs when Jean-seo tears up the contract. He realizes that real power is not the ability to exploit the vulnerable, but the will to protect them. By shifting from a buyer to an absolute guardian, he chooses a path of responsibility. The story posits that the highest form of authority is one that shields the innocent from the wolves of the world. The narrative serves as a warning against using people as currency. Chairman Kang's attempt to save himself by sacrificing his daughter ultimately leads to his total ruin. The moral lesson is clear. Betraying those you are meant to protect for the sake of self-preservation will ultimately invite a far more dangerous destruction. True kingship is defined not by what you own or how many people fear you, but by your capacity to recognize and defend what is truly sacred in a world filled with darkness.